Many early horror films would not be considered part of the genre if they were released today. King Kong, The Most Dangerous Game, and The Penalty were all considered horror back when they were released. Today they are barely at the periphery of the genre. Yet these three films have been included in my all-time favorite book about horror cinema, the Aurum Encyclopedia of Horror, which is also known as the Overlook Encyclopedia in the US. I fully buy the argument for their inclusion. The films were horror because the audience members at the time of their release considered them as such. Still, as a kid, there was one entry in the encyclopedia which always confused me. Or rather, a series of entries. They were the adaptations of the Sherlock Holmes story, The Hound of the Baskervilles. I always considered Holmes as part of the mystery genre, but never horror. So I set out to see each of these films to determine if they belonged in the book, or for that matter, if they belonged here on the channel called History of Horror. With the recent rediscoveries of the previously lost 1914 and 1929 film adaptations, an analysis finally became possible. So, let's take a look at the horrifying Hound of the Baskervilles. The Hound of the Baskervilles is perhaps Arthur Conan Doyle's most famous novel. It was the third of the four books about the brilliant detective Sherlock Holmes, and his steadfast friend and frequent first-person narrator, Dr. John Watson. Doyle also wrote 56 short stories about the pair. Holmes and Watson made their debut in the 1887 novel A Study in Scarlet. The novel was successful, but later short stories like A Scandal in Bohemia launched the pair into the stratosphere of fame, so much so that many readers believed Holmes and Watson to be real people. Arthur Conan Doyle, overwhelmed by Holmes's popularity, killed the great detective off with a plunge down the Reichenbach Falls in the short story The Adventure of the Final Problem. The public protested, but no new Holmes stories authored by Doyle appeared between December of 1893 and August of 1901. The period is by Holmes aficionados called the Great Hiatus. While Holmes was later resurrected in the story The Adventure of the Empty House in 1903, having faked his death, the first story to actually bring Holmes back was a prequel of sorts, taking place before the lethal watery plunge. It was The Hound of the Baskervilles, and it is perhaps the most celebrated novel Doyle wrote, not just because it returned Holmes to his readers, but also because it was a haunting mystery with a supernatural spin. The story takes place on the moors, far from civilization, far from London. After Sir Charles Baskerville is found dead, seemingly having collapsed of fright, the family curse involving a supernatural hound is soon blamed. The hellish hound now hunts Sir Henry Baskerville, the last remaining heir to the estate. Of course, the explanation is entirely natural. A neighbor named Stapleton turns out to also be a Baskerville descendant, and he's killing off his relatives in the hope of claiming the estate for himself. The hound is nothing but a large dog, its fur coated in phosphorus, making it appear like a glowing spectre.
What was that, Watson? What was that?
The atmosphere of the novel is grim in that classic Victorian way, but it is not particularly scary. Certainly not when compared to other horror novels of the era. Bram Stoker's Dracula, Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, and Henry James's The Turn of the Screw are far more oriented towards terror. Arthur Conan Doyle's Hound of the Baskervilles is first and foremost a mystery. But what about the film adaptations? Are they horror? The first adaptation of the book was a German film produced in 1914. The story, however, does not follow the novel closely. Holmes, here played by Alvin Noyce, goes it alone. Watson is basically absent. There's running in and out of various corridors and precious little detecting, or for that matter, dark and moody thrills. The film is action-packed, making the story feel far more like an adventure akin to the serials of the era. It isn't really horror. A British take on The Hound of the Baskervilles followed in 1921, but I can't find much information about it. Film critic Kim Newman describes it mostly as a mystery, not horror. In 1929, another German adaptation was produced. Der Hund von Baskerville is a spookier, broodier version of the tale. Yet, like the first Hound adaptation, this version has a lot of running around through creaky corridors, basically making it a typical haunted house movie of the 1920s. But again, not really horror. The film had a couple of problems. Carlyle Blackwell's performance as Holmes doesn't quite ring true. And, as a silent film produced after the emergence of sound, its commercial prospects were limited. The film flopped and soon it vanished, thought lost forever. In 2009, a copy was located, and the film was restored and re-released on Blu-ray by Flicker Alley in 2019, albeit incomplete with some scenes still missing. The 1914 version is a bonus feature, if you feel like checking them out. A 1931 British adaptation brought The Hound back to its native England. While the film survives in the British Film Institute archives, it is not commercially available. It is said to be an atrocious version of the story. In 1937, the Nazis got in on the action, with yet another German adaptation. This film is available, though I've only seen it in German, without subtitles, so there's not a lot I can tell you about it, other than the curious fact that a copy of this version was found in Hitler's bunker after he committed suicide. So far, honestly, we are 0 for 5, with no Hound adaptation yet arguing the case for inclusion in the horror genre. Perhaps then, this will change once we get to two of the more well-known versions of the story. The first beloved film adaptation of The Hound of the Baskervilles is the 20th Century Fox adaptation from 1939, with Basil Rathbone as Holmes and Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson. Rathbone makes a good Holmes, while Nigel Bruce does the Watson character a slight disservice by playing him too broadly. The atmosphere is moody and gloomy, certainly worthy of horror, but despite the cinematic craft on display, the film never feels like a horror picture. It feels, just like the novel did, like a mystery. Perhaps that's because the scenes with the Hound are played for action and thrills, not really for horror. The film doesn't strive to change the nature of the Hound into something spooky, it just shows it as a mean dog. Alas, again it seems like The Hound doesn't belong in the horror genre. Then, in 1959, Hammer Studios got their hooks into the story. Peter Cushing plays Holmes to perfection, Andre Morell does a good job with Watson, and Christopher Lee makes a tall, dark, and brooding Henry Baskerville. The 1959 adaptation plays up the dark Victorian atmosphere, focusing on the horror far more than any previous version. Hammer Studios had recently had great success with horror films like The Curse of Frankenstein and The Horror of Dracula. But while they also produced films in other genres, like the science fiction film The Quatermass Experiment and the adventure fantasy She, for their Holmes adaptation, they wanted to stick closer to horror. You can see their intentions clear as day on the poster. The combination of moody, painterly sets, Technicolor cinematography, and stellar performances from the leads cements the Terence Fisher-directed version of the story as one of the best adaptations, as well as one of the best films produced by Hammer. Regarding the question we're asking, it is the first film that thoroughly connects the Arthur Conan Doyle story to the horror genre. I wonder if the Hammer version hadn't been made, would earlier film versions have been considered horror, or would they have been viewed primarily as mystery films? Did the impact of the Hammer film color how we see The Hound of the Baskervilles? Perhaps that is the case, or perhaps it was just that at the time the Orem Encyclopedia of Horror was written, all pre-sound versions of The Hound of the Baskervilles were thought to be lost, so an assumption was made. For instance, an eyewitness account of the original release of the 1914 version described the Hound as a hellish, dangerous, scary monster. Clearly, the memory was exaggerated. Several later adaptations followed, too many to list here without getting repetitive, but none are by reputation considered horror. Then, in 2010, Steve Moffat and Mark Gatiss debuted their innovative and transformative take on Holmes and Watson. The BBC series Sherlock featured Benedict Cumberbatch as the detective, and Martin Freeman as Dr. Watson. While Cumberbatch is baroque and excellent, he does have competition for finest Holmes portrayal from the likes of Peter Cushing and Elementary's Johnny Lee Miller. But that being said, Martin Freeman is hands down the finest Watson on screen. Sherlock is a wry, clever thriller, and the 2 first seasons are, simply put, stellar. In the second season, the second episode was titled The Hounds of Baskerville, plural. Written by Gatiss, who also stars as Mycroft Holmes, this episode stands apart from the rest of the series in that it plays on horror and science fiction elements. While everything can be explained rationally in the end, as is the case with every adaptation, there are extended scenes using primarily the narrative language of horror cinema. This, of course, is on purpose. I'd expect nothing less than a horror-friendly take, as writer Mark Gatiss is an avowed horror fan. In fact, he once hosted a documentary miniseries called A History of Horror. In the end, weighing the adaptations up against each other, horror is not the primary driver of the stories. Rather, it is a mystery, which is fair enough given that that is the way of Doyle's original tale. Yet, the argument for considering the Hound as part of our horror legacy lies in the nature of the adaptations from book to screen. Film is a highly visual medium, and the spooky goings-on the moors lend themselves to a horror-oriented treatment. Hammer knew this when they made their 1959 version. Mark Gatiss knew this when he wrote the 2012 episode of Sherlock. And every viewer going to see a Hound adaptation has expected to see a scary Hound. If said Hound isn't pulled off in gruesome detail, then the story disappoints. This is in the DNA of the narrative. Arthur Conan Doyle created a mystery haunted by a hellish Hound, and no matter the down-to-earth solution of it all, the Hound was always supposed to be scary. Sir Charles Baskerville died of fright upon seeing it after all. Thus, terror lies at the foundation of the mystery. The filmmakers at Hammer understood this, and so did Mark Gatiss, and by their collective efforts, I'd say the Hound does belong in the horror genre, if only by the skin of its sharp canine teeth. For it is this touch of horror that makes the Hound of the Baskervilles so incredibly memorable, the creme de la creme of Arthur Conan Doyle's groundbreaking literary creation. Indeed, it is the fear of the Hound that has forever haunted our imaginations, letting us experience horror in the Hound of the Baskervilles. My name is Wolfcraft, you've been watching History of Horror. If you liked this episode, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you want to check out some of my other works, I'm an author. My science fiction novel God of Desolation is available on Amazon, and my urban fantasy mystery novel Richly Drawn will be available soon on inkshares.com. Thanks a plenty.